Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. And I will start out giving you a little bit of background about myself. I am presently a retired professor of applied linguistics at the University of Hamburg. When you're 65 and I'm over 65, you are thrown out of a German university. So what did I do? I looked around and I'm now the head of a PhD program at a small American university in Athens, Greece. And this also has to do with translation. People can actually, I have to do this a little bit as a sort of propaganda talk. You can do this PhD, you get an American degree, the university is accredited in New Hampshire. I'm probably best known for my model for translation quality assessment, which is actually my PhD and goes back to 1976. I'm ashamed to say, but why should I be ashamed? I have revised this model twice, once in 1981 and again in 1997. It appeared in Germany, Gunther Nahr, and I'm now in the process of updating it, and so I'm very happy to be here and listen to people, not from research, but from the industry, profession, clients, and so on. So this new book will appear with Sent to Rome, hopefully sometime in the future, maybe in 2014. Anyway, so I don't want to bore you with details about the model. I just want to very briefly describe my take on translation, and this is of course relevant for this model. I view translation as recontextualization, so the notion of context, which is also relevant for most of us here, is very important in my interpretation of translation, which refers of course to the embeddedness of the original author, the translator, and the recipient in a particular context. Now, context is a very big concept, very vague, so what one needs to do, and that's what I did, you have to break it down into some manageable units, which I call contextual dimensions or parameters or whatever, and these parameters relate to the basic function that language fulfills in life, namely, one, to portray information, to inform about certain states of affairs, and this is related to what I call the function of field. It has to do with the subject matter, has to do with particular styles that represent this content, with the specificity, terminology, and so on. And then the second function of language, as we all know, is related to the people using language, both the author, the stance the author has, and the recipient. So this is the interpersonal thing, and this is related to what is called a tenor, namely, again, the stance, the relationship between the author and the intended recipients, and the participation is the recipient somehow integrated in the text, and so on. And the last type of context that's important is, do we have to do with oral language or written language? Because this is different in terms of the styles, and also interesting in between, something in between oral and written. For instance, what I'm doing now is in between, because there's something written from which I extemporize, okay? So translation is recontextualization, okay? For me at least. And if we start from the assumption that in translation, something like the function or the use of that, something that is there originally, the source text, original text, whatever, is to be kept up in the new text emerging through the work of the translator, then, and that's what I discovered a long time ago, many people have done this as well, in some cases it is not possible to maintain this function, and you have to add other functions. And then I came up with a distinction between covert and overt translation, many different names by many different people. Overt translation for me is a translation where the original basically has to be kept intact somehow, as much as possible, because it travels through time and space and goes somewhere else, is transplanted into a new culture. This, for instance, is the case with texts like a speech, let's say the British Prime Minister, where you have to leave this intact. You can, of course, frame it differently, you can comment, and you can, but it is important to leave it as intact as possible. The covert translation is basically the opposite, where the function is kept up, but seeing that the the text travels to a very different lingua culture, it needs to be changed as much as possible in order to meet the expectations of the new addressee, in order to be amenable to the different communicative styles that are important for certain genres. In order to do this thing, I came up with the notion of the cultural filter, which is basically a concept with which to capture what the translator has to do in order to make this new thing that he or she produces adaptable to the new context. It's just something like a piece of meta language in order to come to grips what actually needs to be done. Okay? So an important point for my take on translation quality assessment is the difference between analysis and evaluation. While a linguistic cultural analysis can be relatively objective, given certain criteria and what needs to be done in order to conduct this analysis, when it comes to evaluation, there's always a modicum of subjectivity. There's a difference. All sorts of social and personal factors impinge on evaluation. To say that evaluation, translation quality is something objective, I think is a bit blind. Okay? So now I come to the important topic for this get-together. Academics, I'm an academic, and the industry or the profession, are they so different? There's a gap. And why? Now, I would say there are different objectives, which doesn't mean that they can't be bridged somehow. But the ideas why people go about doing what they do is different. So for the industry, maybe you object to this because I'm not part of the industry, but this is what I think is being done, particularly having read Joe's wonderful book. Here the idea is more encompassing. There's an instrumental view of translation quality because it includes the translator and his or her competence and how to go about improving it such that we get more effective and better translation. It also has to do more with the process of translation, how it emerges in the work of the translator to make this more transparent, okay? And make it more efficient en route to a maximally effective product. This is how I understand it. Maybe you can object to this. Now, the academics, speaking for myself, of course, have a main interest in fundamental research. And there's a quest for generalizations to abstract from the particulars of the actual path a translator embarks upon when he or she goes about translating. So this is basically coming up with notions like the cultural filter, remember, that I presented to you, which is an abstraction, of course. Also, one is interested in different types of translations and their consequence for translation quality, be they covert, overt, or other translations that relate to certain different genres in different contexts. Okay? Now, the idea then for research or for the academics is to provide concepts and categories with which we can talk about what we're doing when we're translating. So there is, I mentioned this, the provision of a certain meta-language in order to make some kind of community of translators and people talking about translation or researching it. Why are we going back to translation quality now? And the answer is simple, because there's no new research emanating from the community of academics and the community of the profession. Particularly if I look back at my own work, 1976, I told you a long time ago, also 1997 is a long time ago. Corpus work has absolutely inundated us with everything. And I think corpus work is very important and adds a new dimension to previously, from my viewpoint, exemplar-based work. Okay, so we have parallel corpus, comparable, rich reference corpus, and so on. So this is new, and it needs to be taken account in translation quality assessment. There is also an interesting strand of translation research that comes out of China, where I recently gave a couple of lectures, eco-translatology, which I thought is very interesting in that it also glorifies the notion of context. So what they do in eco-translatology is to talk about and to do research on the relationship between the translators and the original authors, the texts and the whole environment, the eco-environment surrounding the texts and the production of the texts. So this, I think, is very interesting. Also, there's interesting work by Sandra Halversen from Norway, who relates bilingualism research and cognitive science and comes up with a conclusion that I would like to also integrate in my revision again about the centrality of the translator. And he or she should be somehow integrated into these models. For instance, something that I have not done in the past but will want to do later. There's also work by Mona Baker, many of you will know her, Manchester. She looks at translation as re-narration. This has nothing to do only with literary texts, but in general. She claims that narratives are useful units for analyzing, better than sentences or paragraphs or whatever, in particular in getting to grips with political, commercial, and activist statements, right? To analyze the text. The other important work also comes out of Manchester. Luis Perez Gonzalez has done interesting work on the co-creational practices in media translation, where you cannot, where the lines between people producing a text and the computer are basically blurred, and that I think should also be taken into account in models of translation quality assessment. And again, I've talked about my own model, and I would like to somehow integrate all of these news trends into this model to make it more adaptable to the present time. Okay. Now, what are the most important issues to tackle in the future for all of us or some of us? Remember the notion of cultural filter as an instrument for changing and adapting the text, to select something and to adapt it. Here we need, I think, extensive, contrastive, pragmatic research for this cultural filtering and for localization. In other words, to know what different people in different countries with different languages, in different genres, what do they expect? The norms are, of course, dynamic and change, but still we need research over and above people's intuitions that this is the expectation norm. This is very, very important, and it needs to be contrastive, pragmatic. I've done a lot of work, but only on English and German over the past 40 years, and came up with generalizations, but there is a definite dearth with other language pairs, okay, to do this sort of thing. Also, a necessity is to integrate the important translation process studies and experimental behavioral studies into translation quality assessment. There's a lot of work, and you all know it, that this needs to be somehow integrated into translation evaluation. What is also important is, and this hasn't been done in terms of integrating it into translation quality assessment, is to examine the role of the one most important language in the world, and this is English, of course, as we all know, whether we like it or not. It's a dominant global lingua franca, and it has an influence on translation quality, because many translators now who are non-native speakers of English now translate into English or out of English, and this must be reflected somehow. This is nothing to say against non-native speakers. I'm the last one. I'm a non-native speaker, but still it should be reflected somehow. Research questions: in a globalized and super diverse world, is it still useful to uphold the dichotomy between source language and target language? Isn't this sort of mixed question? Increasingly mixed. What is the impact of collaborative online translation on the notions of original or source text and target text or translation? Okay. What are and how can we measure the quality differences between volunteer and professional translators? Or are we interested in this? Maybe we're not. I don't know. Are the labels non-professional and professional translators on the web valid and relevant? Maybe we should just ignore it. Okay. And what interests me in particular, because I've looked in many activists from my, political interest, what motivates online volunteer translators to engage in free labor? Why do they do it? I mean, is it a threat to us or not? If traditional translation quality assessment models, like my model, are judged to be outdated and no longer useful nowadays in the online translation community, how can we go about measuring translation quality in this environment? That's probably the biggest question of all. And again, coming back to the role of English, what is the qualitative impact of the rising numbers of non-native English speakers translating into and out of English? Maybe they're even better than native speakers, who knows?